play a game. The rules are simple. You must watch this video to the very end. And also, you have to not laugh at me for that terrible impression. Now, this obviously isn't going to be a very Christmassy video, as you could also tell from the title and the thumbnail and whatever, but we are once again back to our monthly Making a Sequel series. As you can see, we will be covering Saw this time, the horror franchise, which I realise isn't everybody's cup of tea, but hopefully it is as we go through this explanation. You can still find it interesting. Obviously there's nothing I can do to kind of recreate any gore here, even if I wanted to. Hello, I'm Dominic, by the way. Anyway, what's potentially interesting is that last time we did an entry in this series was for Stargate, that very long video, which I do still suggest you watch, because I had fun doing it. But with that one, that ended up being, as I mentioned, I'm predicting a sequel when a sequel is actually potentially already in the works. Well, this time, this is actually here what I came up with for a Saw film. It's something that I came up with in 2017, that kind of the document I drew up for it that wasn't very long, I've managed to find and read back over. Anyway, that prediction I came up with for how the Saw franchise could continue has then already had its continuation, again in 2017 with the film Jigsaw. We're also going to have the film Spiral in 2021 in theory, which is also kind of connected to that, but that may be a reboot or it's something else, I don't know. But either way, we now have here an actual case where we can compare what the actual sequel ended up being to what my prediction for what the sequel could be. Now obviously, as I will go on to discuss the dangling plot threads that I could potentially pick up on, or anyone could pick up on in making a sequel, we're going to be dealing with serious spoilers for these original existing canon stories. Again, even more so maybe than the other ones we talked about, so Five Nights at Freddy's, Mario and Stargate. It's definitely in this case because the Saw films deal in plot twists throughout each film and in the overall overarching narrative in turn. So yeah, what we'll be discussing here are going to be spoilers for like the big twists in those films if you haven't seen them already, but I assume if you're watching this you either have seen them or you don't mind either way about hearing about them. In regards to, potentially for those of you who haven't seen the films who are watching this though, they are very much potentially Marmite films and that people don't like kind of the blood and gore that's going on there. That's perfectly fine, that's perfectly understandable. I just want to clarify, while I do, I am watching for that as well, my actual main reason why I really like this horror franchise, even though I wouldn't necessarily name any individual film as any of my top horror films, the franchise overall with its overarching narrative I would rate up there near the top. It is because of the existence of that overarching narrative, the way that it connects all the stories together with little hints in some films, come back to have payoffs in later ones, and there's twists and things that recontextualise the earlier stuff. And I know that some people in turn will say that that's just really convoluted storytelling, it's just all over the place and muddled, but I think it's woven together really well, even if in some cases it probably was retroactively came up with these different connections, whatever. I like the execution of just plot-wise of all these different pieces that, like a jigsaw, by the end were put together. However, even at the end, but at that time in 2017, we'd got to the end with Saw 3D, Saw the final chapter. There were still some pieces left unlaid, or hidden in mystery. In regards, though, just to give context to the namesake Jigsaw himself, again, just to give that context, so his whole thing is that people don't appreciate the lives that they have, and having gone through such near-death experiences and tragedies himself, through which he changed and came out on the other side, his thing is that if he brings people into situations where they are potentially close to dying, if they make it out the other side, they will have a better appreciation for life afterwards and go on to be better people in society. So he's trying an extreme method of rehabilitation, basically, for people he considers to be bad, or have at least done something wrong that makes him question whether they truly value what they have. Over the courses of these stories, he ended up getting apprentices. And so when we get to Saw 3D, the final chapter, it's essentially civil war between some of these apprentices, or the followers. You have Detective Hoffman as the main one, but you also have Jigsaw's widow, because he's dead by this point, Jill. She's also been tasked with killing Hoffman, and they're kind of going after each other, as well as the main gang going on in the background of the film. And then at the end of it, you have, so Hoffman kills Jill eventually, but then Hoffman is beaten by a surprise reveal of another follower of Jigsaw, Dr. Gordon, who was from the very first film in the franchise. So Gordon is the one where, again, if you know anything about the Saw films, you may know about this. He had to cut off his own foot to escape kind of the room that he was in, which was kind of this, from what I understand, maybe kind of the inspiration of the whole thing of escape rooms. But yeah, he was manacled up and he had to saw off his own foot to get out. And afterwards, after he escaped, after he won the game, it's now learnt that Jigsaw kind of took care of him, gave him like a prosthetic foot, and rehabilitated him. And as part of that afterwards, Gordon kind of aligned with him and helped him with certain things, especially where like there were medical aspects involved to the games and the surgery that was required. And now, as we get to this final film, presumably Gordon has been kind of out of the action for a little bit. I'll come back to that in a second. But he then like receives something as part of John Kramer's last will and testament, basically saying, if anything happens to Jill, I want you to take out Hoffman. So with Hoffman having killed Jill, the last moments of the film suddenly turn around where Gordon shows up, apprehends Hoffman and traps him in the bathroom that was the setting of the very first film, leaving him there to die. But as part of this, Gordon also had two other masked people with him, helping him out. Now, the filmmakers have since said, as far as I understand, they've said who those two masked individuals were meant to be. And they were meant to be from the first game in film 7, like the Love Triangle game. But since we don't actually get any confirmation of that in the film, there's scope for, if we want to do a sequel, actually coming up and say that it was different people under those masks. So who might they have actually been instead? Well, again, it was around this time of 2017, which is what caused me to come up with this kind of prediction theory in the first place, to say if they were to continue the Saw franchise, which it turned out they did. Basically, this theory stated that two characters that had been killed off earlier in the franchise, supposedly being Adam and Amanda, they were actually both still alive. And there's a whole thing with these kind of films where if you don't actually see the moment of death, then there's always ways to work out their resurrection. In both cases, there were very close calls to seeing them die. So the whole thing with Amanda is that before the first film, she was the first subject to the reverse bear trap, but she got out, and afterwards, again, she became one of Jigsaw's acolytes. However, by the time you got to Saw 3, Jigsaw had kind of decided that actually she was playing these games more just to kill people. She wasn't doing it with the intent to rehabilitate them. So he put her secretly through her own game during the course of Saw 3 as well, at the end of which she ends up getting shot in the neck, at which point she drops to the floor. And some people would argue that in theory, if she got soon enough medical attention, she technically could have been saved. We did not actually see her corpse. And at the beginning of Saw 5, because Saw 4 is weird timeline-wise, at the beginning of Saw 5, when the location for Saw 3 is being cleared out by the police, and they're mentioning kind of what they found there, they make no mention of having found Amanda's body. The police knew who Amanda was by this point, and they knew specifically that she was working for Jigsaw. So if they had found her, they surely would have made a note of that in their report. So the fact that there was no mention of Amanda would lead some to imply that maybe someone came and found her, and again, in theory, if they were quick enough, saved her. As for Adam, so at the end of the first film, while Dr. Gordon got out, he sawed off his own foot, Adam failed to do so, and so he became locked in that bathroom that I mentioned before, supposedly to die of thirst. But it's later revealed in a flashback in a subsequent film, I think Saw 3, that Amanda subsequently came in, found him kind of as he was in a deteriorating state, and tried to kill him quicker by putting a plastic bag over his head. And we could talk about motive here, whether she was actually trying to give him a merciful death, put him out of his misery, or if she just actually, again, this is an example of her just wanting to kill. But again, we still technically don't see him die. We just see the moment of her putting the bag over his head and him starting to suffocate. So, what if he was, in turn, saved? Again, we know by this point that Dr. Gordon was around. So what if this was like soon enough after he's been kind of healed by Jigsaw, he's got the prosthetic foot, whatever, and he then goes back to try to rescue Adam, because no matter their differences, so I feel like if he had the opportunity to, he would try to, given how they were at the end of the first film. So maybe Amanda didn't actually succeed in fully suffocating him with the bag, maybe she just assumed she'd done it, or something spooked her and she ran away and he again was left there. Gordon then rescued Adam and snuck him away, but to again hide the fact that he wasn't there anymore, he then moved a new body into its place. Because in Saw 2, we do return to that bathroom and we see that there is a decayed corpse in the spot where Adam was. Now, we actually know in Saw 1 that there was another person who definitively died outside of the bathroom, which was Detective Tapp. So, what if Dr. Gordon took Tapp's body, moved it to where Adam was and took his place, then because by the time we get to Saw 2, because presumably no one else has been in there since, the corpse has decayed so much that you now can't tell the difference between Detective Tapp and Adam. And again, the further reason why some people, again, who were doing this theory that I found, were suggesting this was because if you look at the decayed body in Saw 2, it looks like it's subject to gunshot wounds which match where Detective Tapp was shot, rather than any injury that Adam was subjected to. Okay, so with both of those kind of bared in mind, so we could potentially argue and have some flashback scenes to show that both Adam and Amanda are still alive and they were the ones who helped Gordon. I would say that probably after Gordon rescued Adam to keep him safe, he kind of sent him far away and to start a new life, we can recuperate and do whatever. And maybe just for Saw 7, he contacted him again, and same with Amanda. Again, if we're assuming that Gordon was the one who rescued Amanda, he kind of sent them both away. He brought them back just for this thing. Amanda, I can imagine, definitely would have been up for it because it turns out that the whole reason why she was kind of being set up in Saw 3 for her own game, or why she failed her game, is because she was being manipulated by Detective Hoffman in turn. He wanted to get rid of her, so he was kind of making everything harder. So I can imagine that she would be very much up for helping Gordon take down Detective Hoffman. And as for Adam, maybe it was returning the favour for having saved him before then, again, him going personally back to his witness protection, or the equivalent of that, living off his other new life. But then with that, okay, so we have this solution to the mystery that's kind of still at the end of Saw 7. What would actually be the plot of this new film, though? Because while we get that Dr. Gordon was still kind of the remaining active acolyte of Jigsaw's, and this is kind of where I came back to saying he may have been doing other games as well, because Saw 5, 6 and 7 basically all happen one after the other. They're very consecutive. And with the number of games going on, it kind of feels impractical that it was just Detective Hoffman or Jill, whoever, setting up everything. I think the implication is that it's all Hoffman. So, actually, speaking of which, technically Saws 3 through 7 basically all happen in order, as in like one straight after the other. Maybe just like a bit of implied time between 3, 4 and 5. But yeah, it feels like there's not enough time to elaborately set up everything that's going on there. So maybe Gordon was involved in part of it. I wouldn't have said that it was Amanda helping, because again, if these other games were being set up by someone that Hoffman himself didn't know about, then he would have started to get more suspicious. So again, he thinks Amanda's dead. So if it was suddenly Amanda setting up any of these other games, there again, it's not even in her style, because again, she was more just about killing people. But even if it was, Hoffman will become suspicious and try to investigate it himself, whereas potentially maybe he did know about Gordon, which I think may be implied by their interaction in that final scene in Saw 7. Yeah, he wouldn't question it. He's kind of thinking, okay, that's Gordon doing his own stuff with his own games. But either way, I feel that after this point, after Gordon has fulfilled Jigsaw's last will and testament about dealing with Hoffman per the fall of Jill, he's probably done at this point, because everyone else has been wiped out, so far as he's aware. He'd probably now just return back to his regular life. I don't imagine seeing him setting up yet more games in the future. So who else would instead? Well, there's another proposal, though I don't think this one necessarily has much evidence for it, it's more a matter of this could have been something that happened, is that by the time we were getting to the kind of events of those final films, Hoffman had made himself his own apprentice. And so what we could find in this subsequent film, it's one of Hoffman's apprentices now stepping out into his or her or their own. So what we could have is, if we suddenly start with Adam's perspective, and obviously needing to show how he survived through that, he's living his own life in this new city for however many years, and then suddenly there's reports kind of across the country, these Jigsaw-like games have been going on, but never twice in the same place. And then one is known to happen in the city he's currently in. Knowing kind of his connections to, well, his experience-ish with this sort of stuff, he feels kind of compelled by his guilty conscience that he probably should try to help the police if he can, so he kind of looks in on the investigation, at which point he recognises Dr. Gordon. Now, because he knows that Dr. Gordon was still part of the whole Jigsaw acolyte thing per the end of Saw 7, he presumes that he's the one behind this, so confronts him, but it turns out no, Gordon is investigating this just as much as Adam is. So the two of them, now looking at this, and again, they subsequently discover Hoffman's acolyte. Probably wouldn't be Amanda, because again, it probably doesn't really fit her MO, and it wouldn't be Hoffman, because for him to have now been rescued from the bathroom, that just leads to a continuation of the exact same civil war between the acolytes, which is kind of the same thing I'd say with Amanda as well, is that you're just bringing forward the exact same conflict from before, not just the same characters, but it's all the same thread. Even though we are wanting to make these connections to the previous films with the characters and have a reason to how this came about, you still want it to be its own new branch of the storyline, not just being yet another continuation in that thing from before. So by having Hoffman's own apprentice taking this on, he, she, they have taken on the mantle themselves, and not only that, but they've also set up their own following, and it's now that their different followers are doing all these things around the country. So even after he, she, they are defeated in this film, that then opens the doors for any of the subsequent sequels to then have their completely isolated stories, or at least distinct stories from what's been happening originally, because they're now the new followers of a new follower, do their own things in all these different locations all around the place. And I realised actually now as I was preparing to do this video, that's actually kind of the solution I came up with for my Five Nights at Freddy's sequel one as well, in that it ends with an acknowledgement of a different branch of the franchise, so the new games would follow in that new place as well. That's how you get some variety while still continuing within the same universe. And also to acknowledge, I would definitely say there would have to be sequels, because with something like Saw, you don't just bring it back for one instalment. I mean, you can do, but it feels like it's something that fits sequels, even though I'm aware some people don't like it when things are intentionally made for sequels. It's like, you want to set it up this way, because with what it has with it, right? There's going to be more than one, so you set it up and now allow yourself to have these continuations with these brand new people going forwards in different places. I'm repeating myself at this point. Now, in regards to this as a proposal, I mean, invariably, I would imagine that there would at least be some members of the audience who, again, would have that reaction to the survival of Adam and Amanda to say that that's just so additionally contrived. It's so like how Saw ended up. The first film was the best because it was more like a puzzle. It wasn't all this nonsense of going backwards and forwards. The cat's trying to get on my lap. He's given up, but that was just me doing that there. You come around the other way? Yeah, you're going to have comments about the contrivance of it, but other than that, I think it could be made to work. And either way, this would be the only instalment that is like that. Everything else afterwards would now become slightly more original. Hello. What are you going to do? Me? What are you going to do? Now, how about we compare that to, because that's kind of a very bare bones thing. I don't say anything about the games or the events, just that's kind of the general premise of how you connect to old and new films. Come on. There you go. So then, what about that actual sequel, the film Jigsaw? Well, from the trailers of that, we knew that whoever this new person was had to have some connection to Jigsaw, because the police acknowledged that it's his DNA found at the crime scene, I believe. And they also acknowledged that he's dead, so this definitely has to take place later on than some of the other films. That, therefore, means that whoever this person is had to have some connection to Jigsaw before, and I think, because again, this was around the time of the trailer was when I was coming up with this other idea anyway. I kind of added in, because of that, that if you didn't want to have your connection being to do with Adam or Amanda or Hoffman having a secret apprentice, any of those kind of retcons, then you just say, okay, slightly lesser retcon, and it's just that Jigsaw had another secret apprentice. Well, that is actually, it turns out, what happened. What we find in the film Jigsaw itself is that half of the film is actually a flashback set before the events of the first Saw film. We knew games were happening before then anyway, if not necessarily many. So yeah, we're seeing the games from that, and one of the people from that earlier game, or set of games, was the one who went on to become one of the acolytes of Jigsaw and just kind of acting more in the shadows and on the sidelines. But he's now come back in the present to set off this new stuff. Which is this is more specifically based on the trailer, so we already had some evidence for it anyway, but that was basically what happened. We had no acknowledgement of any of the other surviving characters, really, other than, again, well, not a surviving character, but we had an acknowledgement of Jigsaw himself. But the film otherwise kind of was rather completely distinct from that. We had nice little Easter eggs of a load of the traps or replicas of the traps from previous films, but nothing really else other than that, which is fair enough. And at the end of it, you are left with this new person being able, if they wanted to, go off and do their own more games elsewhere across the country. It's not a following, but it's still, again, just that one person could potentially start it up again. I think you do have, again, what's acknowledged in there is there's now like an online community of people who are really fascinated with all the Jigsaw killings. So you could potentially go down the line of, kind of as was the red herring in this film, like you're meant to believe it's going to be someone from this community that's the killer, but it's not. But in the sequels, he could potentially get people from that online community to help out and be radicalized as well, if he wanted to. Again, I'm not sure if that's really what's going to be happening with Spiral, because Spiral, as to say, well, I don't know much about it, does seem to be more of a rebooty kind of thing, but again, we will have to see. Anyway, just with that, again, say shorter than the last sequel video, which was again all that hours of Stargate, just some kind of ideas, short bits about what could have been done with a continuation of the Saw franchise based upon just a couple of mysteries left at the end of the 7th film, and then just a brief comparison there just at the end to what actual sequel then came about, which of course you can now go and watch yourself if you so wish, if you do want to directly compare the source material. Obviously, I don't really have a way of proving that I had these kind of ideas back in 2017 as opposed to now. This isn't meant to be anything impressive and showing off how I partially predicted the film, whatever. If you're going to continue it, there were certain predictable ways it would have been done, but I still wanted to address it because it was a thing that I had come up with before, in the same way that I had done a Mario game idea before, I'd done the FNAF idea before, the Stargate idea before, so I wanted to include it in the series as well and say, while it may not quite match the time of year, maybe it was more of a Halloween thing, this is just how the schedule of video recordings ended up from when I drew it up previously. I hope you've found that interesting. Next time we do this, next month, we'll be tackling something that maybe more people are slightly familiar with, but also in turn has some content, which means it obviously won't have been for all audiences, which is Game of Thrones. But again, I'll clarify what I mean by saying we're doing a Game of Thrones sequel when we get to that video, so stay tuned in 4 weeks' time for that. In the meantime, if you celebrate, I hope that you're going to have a good Christmas. Again, I'll be saying this again next week as well, but also remember, while we still have time before the day itself, if you're looking for gifts to give someone or yourself and you/they like reading, then why not check out the Non-Chronicles books themselves, the books upon which this channel usually is basing its contents. The Gift of the Manson, The Ark of Angels, available from the links in the description down below, both paperback and ebook, sci-fi mixed with mythology, if that sounds appealing to you at all. If you want to see if it may sound appealing, you want to check before you buy it, you can also look at other videos on this channel where I have been discussing some stuff from the lore of that franchise, and either way, whatever you decide, until I see you again, just remember to keep on telling stories. So, yes, let's compare this to Jigsaw. What happened in that film? Well, it turned out that we had another secret apprentice of Jigsaw's. So far as we're aware, it wasn't anyone who... oh, let's not step on the laptop. So far as we're aware, it wasn't anyone who... Jeez.